Meditation of Judas. Do what you have to do, he told me. And I realized then, as he looked at me, from the expression in his eyes, that he knew full well what I'd been up to and understood precisely what I'd planned for later that evening. Call me a fool, but I thought until then I'd covered my tracks, played the part of doting disciple to a T. And I was right to a point, for my fellow apostles fell for it hook, line, and sinker. You should have seen their faces when Jesus suddenly turned during supper and solemnly announced that one of us would betray him. "Who is it, Lord?" they gasped. "Surely not I?" But they actually believed it might be, as much one of them as me. Not Jesus, though. I realized the moment he looked at me that there was no pulling the wool over his eyes. He saw through the charade, behind the lamb to the wolf, beneath the dove to the serpent. And suddenly I was ashamed, sickened by what I was doing, disgusted at what I'd become. I should have stopped it there and then, confessed everything before them all, and begged for mercy. But I didn't. I was too proud, afraid of losing face, terrified of what Caiaphas might do to me if I failed to deliver the goods. So I slithered out of the room, leaving the rest of them wide-eyed in disbelief. It still wasn't too late even then. I could have called a halt to the whole business, and I only wish I had. But I didn't. I led the soldiers into the garden and greeted Jesus with a kiss, the last revolting act of a repulsive evening. It was bad enough betraying a friend, but what made it worse was that we'd eaten together such a short time before. He'd washed my feet, shared bread and wine, kept faith with me to the very last despite everything. If he had cursed me, accused me, rebuked me, it would have made it easier. If he'd only shown some sign of resentment, maybe then I could have lived with myself, knowing he wasn't so perfect after all. But there was none of that. A hint of sorrow, perhaps, but apart from that, only love, compassion, forgiveness. He knew what was happening, yet it made no difference. He knew I was leading him to his death, and he carried on regardless. Why? You tell me. I only hope he had more idea what he was doing than I had. Meditation of Pilate's wife. I told him not to get involved. Leave it alone, I said. Stay out of it. After all, you're the governor. You're the one in charge. Let the Jews sort it out. Send them off to Herod. Get someone else to do your dirty work for a change. It's not your problem. So what did he do? Made a right botch of things, that's what. Oh, he tried all right. I'm not denying that. He wanted to wash his hands of Jesus as much as I did. More, if anything. I've never seen him so agitated, so uncertain what to do. And to be fair, he took my advice to a point. Sent the man off to Herod just as I suggested, but he let him send Jesus back. That's what I can't understand. He let that cunning old devil off the hook and left himself in the lurch. Honestly, men. After that, it was downhill all the way. You decide, he told the crowd, Barabbas or Jesus. It's up to you. Brilliant. They could all see what he was angling for, and they were damned if he was going to get it. "Give us Barabbas," they shouted. And you could almost hear the chuckle. They could scarcely keep the smirk off their faces. So there he was. Nowhere else to turn, no one else to turn to, the decision his and his alone. Yet even then, all wasn't lost. He should have stood up to the mob, listened to his conscience, not that he ever has before, mind you. But when they suggested his loyalty might be suspect, his job on the line, that settled it. Now look at him. I thought my nerves were bad, but his, they're shot right through. He just can't forget the man, night or day, never a moment's peace. He's tormented by shame, riddled with guilt. Well, I tried to warn him. I couldn't do more. He made his decision, and now he has to live with it. But I can't help wondering sometimes when I look into his eyes, when I catch that haunted, hunted expression deep within, just who passed judgment on whom that day? Was it Pontius who condemned Jesus? Or was he the one condemned? The soldier. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. I'm a soldier, so I try not to listen when I hammer in the nails. I try not to listen to what the condemned man may say. Otherwise, you lose your beauty sleep. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. I've heard curses and threats and brave defiance, but never, never, as the hammer swung, concern for me. At least that's what it seemed as I was shocked into meeting his eyes, the hammer heavy and stilled in my hand for one dreadful ice-cold moment. Through the blood and thorns and nails, his eyes met mine with tenderness. Suddenly, I wanted my mother and my wife and my gentle daughter to cradle my head in their laps and hide me from this man's gaze. And here I am, throwing dice, with his words hammering in my head, hammering in my heart, like nails of love and forgiveness and tenderness, piercing me for all eternity. Meditation of Peter. He was bleeding, my friend Jesus, skewered to that cross, like a piece of meat, great drops of blood trickling slowly to the ground, from his head, from his hands, from his feet. I watched, stricken with horror, numbed with grief, as the life seeped away. And I asked myself tearfully, angrily, why? Why had God let it happen? Why didn't he step in and do something? What was he thinking of? It seemed criminal, a stupid, senseless waste to let such a wonderful man die, let alone to die like that. And for a moment my faith was shattered. In myself, in God, in everything. But then I remembered his words, just the night before when we had broken bread together. "This is my blood shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." And even as I remembered, so that other time came back, there by the Sea of Galilee, after he had fed the multitude, the crowd pressing round him, asking for more. "Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink." They had been a mystery to me until then, those words. Hard to stomach, if you'll pardon the pun. But suddenly, there beneath that cross, I began to understand just a little only the merest fraction, yet enough to help me realize it wasn't all in vain. That somehow Jesus was hanging there for me, for you, for everyone. I still ask why, mind you, and I think I always will, for I'll never get that picture out of my mind, that picture of Jesus broken on the cross. Why that way, God, and not another? Why not something less brutal, less awful, less messy? Yet the strange thing is, he never asked why. Not once in all the days I knew him. Oh, he'd have liked there to be another way, of course. He didn't want to die any more than the next man. But he offered his life freely, willingly, lovingly, in the conviction that through his dying, we might truly live. Meditation of John. He was groaning, a sound like I'd never heard before, a sound I never want to hear again, awful, stomach churning, indescribable, the sound of unimaginable pain, of overwhelming sorrow, of utter isolation. And I could watch it no longer. I thought I was ready for it, prepared for the worst, for I knew he had to die. But I wasn't ready, not for this. I never realized people could suffer so much, that anything could be quite so terrible. But I know now, and I'm telling you straight, I'd have felt sorry for anyone facing that, a robber, a mugger, even a murderer. My heart would still have bled for them. But to see Jesus there, a man of such gentleness and compassion, a man who had always loved and never hated, a man who had brought healing to the sick and wholeness to the broken, it all but finished me. What had he done to deserve this? What crime had he committed? What was it about him that aroused such passion, such devotion, and such loathing? I prayed that God would finish it, put him out of his misery, but still the torment continued. Still they mocked him, delighting in his pain. I knew he was suffering, but even then didn't realize how much, not until he lifted his head and I saw the despair in his eyes. Meditation of Mary, wife of Clopas. He was silent, quite still, his body limp and lifeless, like a rag doll, like a broken puppet. And I thanked God that at last it was over, his ordeal finally ended. But it wasn't, not quite. He moved again, just the faintest twitch, the last flickering ember of life, but enough to prolong our hopes, enough to prolong his pain. He was still breathing, still suffering. We watched wretchedly, torn by conflicting desires, the longing to see him come down and prove his enemies wrong, the longing to see him find peace in the cold embrace of death. But suddenly his eyes were open, wide, bright, triumphant. The lips were moving, eager, excited, exultant. And his voice rang out, "It is finished." An acknowledgement of defeat, some said afterwards, a last despairing cry of sorrow, but it wasn't. Not for those who heard it, Not for those with ears to hear. It was altogether different, like sunshine after storm, like rain after drought, like laughter after tears. Gloriously unexpected, wonderfully surprising. He had stooped and conquered, staked all and won. Defeat was victory, darkness was light, death was life. I didn't see it then, mind you. I can't pretend that. It was just a glimpse at the time, a glimmer barely understood. But what I did see with sudden, staggering clarity was that until that moment, until that last victorious shot, he had lived with the awful burden of holding the world's fate in his own and wondering whether he could see it through. At last, it was done. He had honored his calling, fulfilled his mission, walked the way of the cross. It was finished. And with a song in his heart and joy in his eyes, he bowed his head and surrendered his spirit. Meditation of Mary Magdalene. It was over, finished. 33 years of life, 3 years of ministry, 7 days of turmoil, 6 hours of agony finally ended, and I couldn't believe it. Yes, I know that sounds daft, having stood there and watched him die, having seen them drive the nails into his hands, having watched the spear thrust in his side, having witnessed his dying breath. What else did I expect, you may ask? What other outcome could there possibly have been? And I understand all that, for I knew he was dying. Of course I did. And when it finally happened, when the end came, I was numb, unable to take it in, paralyzed with grief. It just didn't seem possible that this man Jesus, whom we had known and loved, whom we had trusted and followed, who had been the very center of our lives, could have been taken from us, snuffed out, never to be seen again. It wasn't that he didn't prepare us. You could never accuse him of that. He'd spoken of death until we were sick and tired of hearing it. And we honestly thought we were ready, that we had taken it all in, come to terms with the inevitable, steeled ourselves to face the worst. But we hadn't. Not when it came to the wire. The theory was one thing, the reality something else. I realized as we stood there, the tears rolling down our faces, our hearts torn in two, that we'd always expected him in the final chapter to come up smiling, put one over on those wretched Pharisees and showed them who was boss. But of course it wasn't like that. Nothing like it at all. It was over, finished, just like he had said it would be. And I couldn't get my head round it. Couldn't make sense of it, whatever. Yet there's one thing I've held on to since that awful moment, one memory which has brought comfort even in the darkest of hours, and that is those last words of his, the cry that he uttered with such dreadful yet confident finality. "It is finished," he shouted. "It is finished." Words spoken not in sorrow, not in anger, not in weary resignation, but in a tone of sheer thanksgiving, as though somehow even there, especially there, he had accomplished the very thing he came to do. And so, Father, as we come to the end of these meditations, these special Good Friday meditations, we give you thanks for all that Jesus was prepared to endure for our sakes. We're reminded again of the hugeness of your love for us, the hugeness of Jesus' love for us, that he was ready to sacrifice his life that we might have life. And as we're faced by the cross once again today, we bow our heads and we acknowledge this huge sacrifice, this huge gift of love, the huge cost to you, Father, and to Jesus, the great agony, the suffering, the humiliation. And we are so grateful. And we would like you to know once again that we appreciate you and everything you have done for us, that we might find life, that we might be set free from all the powers of darkness that seek to keep us in bondage. We thank you that you are light, that you are love, and that you offer peace even in dark times, even in suffering. And we give ourselves to you once again this Good Friday and ask that we might live for you, that we might love you, that we might serve you by serving others, that we might worship you, that we might offer everything that we are in order to bring you glory, to fulfill your purposes, to help the world to know a little more of the light that Jesus came to bring. Amen.